morning, everyone. Our group will be presenting on Farid Khan, the 2017 presidential hopeful, and as we all know, Raisa Khan's father. The first criteria had been the reserved presidency for the Malays in accordance with how the elections are reserved for the ethnic group that has not been represented in the last 5 consecutive elections. Prior to the nominations, the candidates would have to submit his or her nomination paper accompanied by a certificate of eligibility, a community certificate to certify the candidate as Malay, and a political donation certificate. We will further elaborate on the community certificate later on in the presentation. The second criteria had been the financial criteria, whereby candidates from the private sector must have been the chief executive of a company with at least $500 million in shareholders' equity. This had been changed in the election year itself with the increase from $100 million to $500 million. With that in mind, we now look at the 3 candidates who were deemed eligible in accordance with the first criteria, whereby the presidential election had been reserved for Malays. We have Halimah Yacob, Farid Khan, and Saleh Marikan. However, as we know, Farid Khan and Saleh Marikan had been deemed ineligible in accordance to the financial criteria. In his IC, Farid Khan is reflected as a Pakistani. He practices the religion of Islam, and his second language is Malay. He grew up in Singapore in Geylang Serai. Farid Khan's career is as follows. He had been the chairman of Bourbon Offshore Asia, the managing director of Bumi Subsea Asia, the CEO of Greenship Holdings since 2013, and the director of Max Surf Private Limited. However, as mentioned earlier, he had been deemed ineligible for the elections as he fell short on the criteria of helming a firm with at least $500 million in shareholder equity for the recent 3 years following up to the presidential election in 2017. It had been a key threshold for the private sector candidates.
So we'll now look at who exactly defines what it means to be Malay. And in the context of the Singapore presidential elections, there are 3 main ways that this is determined. So firstly, by laws, secondly, public opinion, as well as thirdly, self-identification. We'll now look at the legal requirements and in particular the Malay Community Certificate, also known as MCC. Now, for the presidential election, to be nominated as a candidate, the candidate must produce the community certificate that certifies that he or she belongs to the Malay community. And we can see from the issue of the Malay Community Certificate for the presidential election in 2017, all 3 candidates that applied for the MCC were issued the certificates, and this includes Farid Khan as well. However, based on our research, there does not seem to be a fixed criterion with which the Malay Community Committee decides whether a candidate is Malay or not. And the committee may, for the purposes of determining whether the person belongs to the Malay community, either require the applicant to provide more information, interview the applicant, inform itself on any matter, or consult any person. But there is not a hard and fast rule of how they define who is Malay. Now, when it comes to Twitter, we'll now look at the public opinion aspect, and we'll be uncovering 2 main channels, Twitter and online news articles. Now, when it comes to Twitter, debate was not as heated as how it was with President Halimah Yacob, but there were still a few people who voiced their opinions, such as people claiming that he is not Malay, or that due to his Pakistani heritage, he should not be counted as Malay. Now, when it came to the online news articles, you did have your local news sites such as Mothership, red wire as well as middle ground weighing in on whether Farid Khan was Malay enough to be running in the presidential election. And once again, they referred specifically to his Pakistani descent. But quite interestingly, you also had your overseas news sites such as India.com weighing in on this issue as well.
And finally, we will look at the aspect of self-identification in defining one's Malayness. When asked about his ancestry, Farid Khan notes that he is of Pakistani descent, but immediately talks about how he is born and raised in the Singaporean Malay community. He uses the same language as well as shares the same culture and values as other Malays in Singapore. And thus, he argues that these factors makes him belong to the Malay community. We can conclude from these that Farid Khan defines his self-identity from a constructivist perspective where he uses his unity and sameness with the Malay community to construct his own self-understanding of identity. Farid Khan's self-identification is in line with the government's point of view of not only looking at one's birth to determine one's identity, but to also look at the culture one adopts and is recognized by in the community.
Our group will approach defining Malay from a constructivist perspective. These are some of the features that our approach will be using in our presentation moving forward. Firstly, it is governed by self-understandings rather than universal self-interest. It is also used to denote unity. This means that it has a fundamental sameness among members. It is also used to understand self as core and as fragments. Lastly, it is also used to instrumentalize, becoming a product of social and political action to understand the fragmented self. Our definition. After engaging with the course materials, we have decided that a working definition of the term Malay should consider these key identifiers carefully. An ability to speak the Malay language, or Bahasa Melayu, birthplace to be within the geographical boundaries of the Malay world itself, cultural assimilation to the Malay community, and being Muslim. The Malay language. Malay language in colonial legacy was actually used to differentiate coastal Malays from indigenous tribal people in the early part of history. Language then was used as a basis for investigating and classifying people. This afterwards brought about the birth of Malay term as political, social, racial, and biological category in the colonial context. This prevailing narrative is still prevalent in Singapore's current socio-cultural context. Our group feels that this is relevant to Farid Khan's circumstances, as Singapore still adopts a colonial framework in governing Singapore. Next, our group will borrow Munshi Abdullah's definition of what it means to be Malay. Munshi Abdullah's characterization of himself as Malay is a theoretical framework in which we can use to view the Malay identity in Singapore. Munshi Abdullah, like Farid Khan, is of mixed descent, but he is currently celebrated in Singapore as a Malay icon because of his literary contributions. This is similar to Farid Khan's case for being able to share the same language.
As for birthplace and culture, the Malay identity is primarily that of a working class identity. And nevertheless, there have been desires within the community for social mobility and upward mobility in general to move away from situations where families are in multiple cycles of poverty. And there has been a growing desire for a Malay middle class status, not just from Malay communities themselves, but governments both in Singapore and in Malaysia who have attempted to institute social programs and in some cases explicit affirmative action which enables the Malay community to to move upwards in terms of its social status. Nevertheless, Malay culture has also been defined in a sense by the broader struggle in the face of systemic disadvantages, be it in terms of, poverty or in terms of, say, starting a new business. And so the disadvantages in terms of not having capital or access to capital, or the benefit of a strong business network that is able to provide you with trusted relationships as well as reasonable access to industry information and knowledge. Also, being Malay entails sort of having the affinity towards the land, the culture, and as we mentioned, the language of the Malay archipelago or the Nusantara, and respecting these traditions and embracing them as one's own identity. Nevertheless, tensions still remain, particularly when you consider different aspects of Malay identity. Malay identity is closely tied to Muslim identity, and there is often a desire to be part of a broader Muslim community or a ummah. But sometimes this comes in conflict with national identity, as in the case of Singapore, where politicians often insist that national identity should be prioritized before religious identity, and that connections on a religious basis, while important, should not supersede loyalty to one's own country and one's own land and people and the nation state itself.
Islamic identity. In the early history of the Malay world, Islam was used as a way of differentiating Malays from the uncivilized or animistic indigenous tribes. This denoted an early method in which the exclusive Malay identity was formed in regards to Islam. This subsequently evolved over time during the Islamization period of the Malay world in the 1500s to the 1800s. Brought about by the earlier Kerajaan states that incorporated certain Islamic elements into public discourse, this Islamization period was brought about by Southeast Asian scholarly interpretations of Islam that came to redefine the Malay culture and henceforth identity thereafter. This merged the identity of Malay and Muslim together, creating a culture inseparable from each other moving forward. Farid Khan, who is Muslim, would be attuned to the cultural understandings of the Malay Muslim community in this way. It denotes an assimilation into the Malay community, and so he can represent the community's concerns at policy level. In reconciling the set guidelines as determined by various stakeholders with our group's own definition of what makes up the Malay identity, we can conclude that Farid Khan would indeed qualify as Malay. Thus, he should be able to run for the presidential election under this pretext. This, however, does not denote a unanimous acceptance of his Malay identity as demonstrated by some members of public. The constructivist approach that our group has taken would undoubtedly be met with response from people who subscribe to the primordialist approach of fixing one's identity to ethnicity. For Farid Khan, this means that he is Pakistani. Fortunately, the Singapore government and Farid Khan himself has chosen to view the concept of identity as a constructivist one, aligning with our group's position. In this definition, the Malay identity is shaped by self-understandings of the individual and the idea of sharedness rather than sameness within the Malay community itself. This is a more inclusive concept of identity which bodes well for the multicultural nature of Singapore itself.